Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky joins me now, member of the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee. Senator Paul, good to see you today. Thank you for being here. So you heard Dr. Fauci. He said that your accusations against him have put his life in danger, and you accused
personal attack. To say that I'm responsible for death threats on him would be equivalent to myself or Steve Scalise saying that the Bernie Sanders supporter that shot us, that it was Bernie Sanders' responsibility. So you remember the shooting at the ball field. I was 10 feet from a young man who was shot. I was about 20 yards from Steve Scalise, who was shot. Not one Republican came forward and said it was Bernie Sanders' fault because this was a supporter of his. And so when Democrats say that, and Fauci is a Democrat partisan, when he says it, he's trying to deflect. Because what I was asking him about is this. He says that he is science, and that if you question him or oppose him, you're opposing science. But this kind of arrogance also led him and Dr. Collins to say they would take a takedown of 3 epidemiologists who started the Great Barrington Declaration. They're from Stanford, Oxford, and Harvard. They called them fringe. They orchestrated a takedown campaign in the lay media, not in the scientific journals on the merits, but in the lay media. And so he didn't want to answer my question, so he accuses me of fomenting violence. But it's a misdirection because he doesn't want to accept that basically he has become a political animal and that everything he does every day is to further his political agenda, not the science.
You know, he's obviously under pressure, and I think that it has been politicized. There's sort of people who are pro-Fauci and people who are against Fauci. But at one point you did say to him, you are the person who is more responsible for the deaths in this country than anyone else. Do you think that's fair?
Well, look at it this way. I believe that this virus originated from a lab, that it was engineered by the Chinese. We don't have 100% proof of that, but we have, I think the evidence leans 90-10 that this came from the lab. He funded the lab. He tried to obscure the idea that he was giving money to the lab. And then he steadfastly for 2 years said it wasn't gain of function, that they weren't taking viruses that don't exist in nature, creating them and creating viruses that are so dangerous that they could actually wipe out a portion of humanity. He continues to deny that. If this came from the lab, yes, he's culpable. So when you ask him to investigate it, he's not exactly disinterested. He has a conflict of interest because if it came from the lab, yes, he deserves some moral culpability. The virus ultimately came from Mother Nature, so Mother Nature deserves most of the blame. But if it also came out of a lab, then I think man has some to blame, and I think Fauci would be involved in this. He still deserves blame because he says he still trusts the Chinese, and he's not for any more regulations on gain of function. He just thinks it's jolly well and good to create these viruses. You know, if we're in charge in 2022, I promise you we get to the bottom of this, but we get to the bottom of this so we don't have this happen again. I think there should not only be prohibitions domestically, I would be for convening an international treaty of civilized nations to say we shouldn't be doing this kind of research because of the threats it has to mankind.
I mean, there is no doubt that Dr. Collins and Dr. Fauci waved everyone off of this whole idea of even looking at the lab. And that does raise questions. I've raised those questions with both of them over the course of the last year. And I think it's very fair to ask why. Why did they wave everyone off of questions about the lab? And obviously, he gets very prickly whenever this topic is brought up. They're losing the faith of the American people. Do you trust the CDC to give you accurate information about COVID? That number, trust, has gone down by 3 points. Do not trust has gone up by 5 points in the recent polling. And, I'm struck when I listen to this hearing, Senator Paul and Dr. Paul. I read these stories in the Wall Street Journal about studies from Denmark and studies from Ontario that show that the vaccinated might be more likely to contract Omicron. Then there's another one today that says, slow the spread, speeding it might be safer, suggesting, this is Dr. Ramaswamy, suggesting that if we work too hard to control Omicron, it might end up creating a super variant. And I feel like, these questions that are being raised, I don't know if these things are accurate. They're reported in the Wall Street Journal. I feel like we're behind the curve. We're having a conversation about last version of COVID rather than what's going on right now.
But the thing is, see, Dr. Fauci doesn't want the debate. He wants to squelch debate because he is science. If you criticize him, you're criticizing science. So one of the big things in the committee hearing today was the lack of testing. Well, shouldn't we ask the question, who should be tested? Now, that question was finally asked, but that's coming from Fauci. Almost everything we've done has come from Fauci and Walensky and the powers that be. They want to test everybody. If one kid in kindergarten gets it, it's a non-deadly disease. They test everybody in the class and they send them home. Then they test all their relatives. We should test people who are sick and people who are vulnerable. Fauci denies that 100 million people in our country have immunity, so he thinks that we're under-vaccinated. The truth of the matter is, over age 65, 95% of people in a country voluntarily took the vaccine. It's an overwhelming success. And there should be a debate. Should we let kids ultimately, what happens in nature happens in nature, and we protect the elderly? What's happening anyway, despite the vaccine, this is very transmissible, and the vaccine's not stopping transmission. So should we subject all our kids to it? I think that's an honest question we should ask.
It is an interesting question, and I would direct people towards that Wall Street Journal editorial so they can read it and see what they think. Dr. Paul, thank you. Good to see you, Senator, as always.